It has been over a year since the release of Avengers Endgame. Without question, the biggest film in cinematic history, a landmark achievement in cinematic storytelling and franchise building. Many movie studios have tried and failed to make a movie like this. Only Marvel could pull something like this off with such style and grace. And look, nobody here today is going to debate whether or not Avengers Endgame is a good movie, because it is. It is a good movie. It's just that for me, it's just a good movie. I don't think it's the greatest comic book movie of all time. I don't think it's necessarily the greatest Marvel movie of all time. And I don't really think it's the greatest Avengers movie of all time. Now, apparently, this opinion makes me a moron, but I'm used to it by now. Again, to be clear, I do like Avengers Endgame. I do think it's good, but there's just a lot in it that's keeping it, in my eyes at least, from being truly great. And one of those things is, believe it or not, the film's runtime. I mean, let's be real here. 3 hours is a really long time for any movie of any kind. And yeah, Endgame was supposed to be big and epic, but there is such a thing as too big and too epic.
Yeah, it's definitely big, all right. I just wonder if it's too big, you know?
I just felt like the story that they were specifically trying to tell could have been done in less time. That's all. But hey, what do I know? It's not like I could just take the movie and re-edit it to be less than 3 hours long. Or can I? So yeah, I am taking 2019's Avengers Endgame, directed by Anthony and Joe Russo and edited by Jeffrey Ford and Matthew Schmidt, and seeing if I can make it shorter. How much shorter? Well, that's the trick. I still want this to be a coherent, watchable experience at the end of it all. I can't just remove large chunks of the film and expect it to not be jarring and confusing. But I do think it is possible to reduce this film's runtime by a significant amount. I'm not saying cut a whole hour out of the film, but at least try to make a dent in it, at least for a start. This might just be the first step in a much larger project down the road, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm sure there are some of you out there who are like, well, why not just remove the end credits? That's like 20 minutes right there. And you know what? You're right. The end credits for Avengers Endgame are 13 minutes long. And it's longer than most movies because they got a whole lot of people in the cast, a whole lot of special effects crew out there, and they decided to add the autographing scenes to it to signify that this is the last ride for the original Avengers. But even cutting the 13-minute end credits, you're still left with a 2 hour and 43-minute movie. That's still a pretty long film, and I think we can cut it down even more from there. Before I even thought about re-editing Avengers Endgame on my own, I knew that there were certain things that had to stay in the movie regardless. I couldn't just remove certain scenes wholesale without affecting the overall structure of the film. I knew that establishing shots had to be there to set up the scenes and locations. I knew certain reaction shots were as long or as short as necessary, depending on what the scene was trying to convey. So overall, the main goal of this project was to keep as much of Avengers Endgame intact and just trim out the fat. Keep scenes the way they were, but just remove anything that might be extraneous, any extra bits that didn't feel like they absolutely had to be there. Also, too, full disclosure, I'm obviously not working with the master files of Avengers Endgame. That's locked up in a vault somewhere at Disney Studios. I'm really just working off of a Blu-ray rip that I got from a friend. So these edits are going to be pretty jarring. I did my best, but they're not the smoothest transitions. And I don't mean for this to be my definitive preferred method for watching Avengers Endgame. This is really just more of an experiment to see if it could be done. And I think it could be done. So we start this whole thing off simply enough by just opening up Adobe Premiere and loading in a digital copy of Avengers Endgame. From there, it's really a simple matter of just watching the movie and pausing every now and then to pick out the scenes or the moments that don't feel all that necessary, that feel like they could just be easily removed and then move on with the rest of it. Ironically, this wound up making a typically 3-hour viewing experience much, much longer, but these are the things you do in the name of science. And if you're wondering, yeah, this was a lot harder than I initially thought it would be. Certain moments that I thought could just easily be removed wound up being pretty essential to the overall plot and had to wind up staying even if it made the runtime much longer. For example, there's a scene in the movie where Thor is explaining what the Reality Stone is. He spends a significant portion of this scene drunkenly going through the plot of Thor: The Dark World. So initially, it made sense to cut this or at least shorten it, because after all, you've probably seen Thor: The Dark World. You probably remember what that movie was about, so you don't really need to see that recapped again here in this movie. But then you get to the scene later on in the film when Rocket and Thor are on Asgard in the past, and Thor has a visceral emotional reaction to seeing Jane Foster and his mother. This scene doesn't really make a whole lot of narrative sense without the previous scene to establish it. And on the off chance you didn't see The Dark World, then this scene becomes that much more important, so it has to stay. The movie is actually filled with a lot of moments like this, moments you would think would be inconsequential, but then wind up being important later on. The scene where Tony and Steve go back to the past has a moment like this, where Steve Rogers hides out in Peggy Carter's office. You initially think it's a cute little aside to remind the audience of Steve Rogers and his love for Peggy. But then again, without that scene, the big payoff at the end, where Steve finally goes back to the past and gets his final dance with her, doesn't have the same emotional payoff. So it kind of needs to still be in the film. I also couldn't necessarily cut much of the action scenes in this movie. I did try to whittle down the final battle between the Avengers and Thanos and his army, but I really couldn't, because it's like 30 minutes from when Thanos first attacks Avengers HQ to the moment when Tony Stark snaps his fingers and ends everything. Any edit I would have tried to make in that time frame would have wound up ruining the flow of the action and making things make less sense. So that pretty much had to stay intact. Also, the movie has a surprising amount of one-take scenes, like the introduction of Hawkeye as Ronin, and the scene in the middle of the big battle right after Steve says Avengers Assemble, and all of the Avengers show off their big moves for the first time all together. Those are all done in one take, so you really can't just clip out a part of that in the middle of it. They had to stay as they were. So what wound up getting cut, you may ask? Well, ultimately, incidental things. Extra shots of characters reacting to something, or maybe like a joke here and there that didn't really add much to the scene. You would be surprised by the amount of incidental stuff I wound up removing. The Russo brothers seem to have made the conscious decision to just use the longest takes possible of the Avengers reacting to what each other had to say, or looking off at something in the distance. Hell, there's a full 10 seconds of black before the title card 5 years later appears on screen. And even then, the 5 years later title card comes up very slowly. Really, most of the cuts I made were silly little jokes or one-liners or snide remarks that the Avengers make toward each other. The Marvel films are kind of notorious for having these little funny moments interspersed between big serious moments, and the little funny moments wind up undercutting the drama that they're trying to portray. In doing this experiment, you realize that 9 times out of 10, taking out these jokes doesn't really affect the overall structure of the film. In fact, it returns the dramatic weight that was robbed by the inclusion of these one-liners. Like, take the scene where Nebula is explaining where the Soul Stone is. She talks about Vormir and how it was the place where Thanos killed her sister. This scene is played very dramatically, and it sets up the fact that not only are the Avengers in for a very dangerous mission and that one of them might not be coming back, but it reminds the audience that yes, Gamora had to die in order for the Soul Stone to appear. The Avengers might have to make a similar sacrifice. So of course, rather than keeping the tone serious, they have Ant-Man make a funny little comment about it.
Not it.
So many scenes in this movie have little quips like this. I couldn't cut them all, but I wound up cutting about 5 or 6 minutes worth of them. That's not an insubstantial amount, even for a 3-hour movie. But jokes are one thing. Did I make any truly controversial cuts? Well, I'm sure I did. I'm an amateur video editor re-editing a beloved Hollywood movie to suit my own personal tastes. I'm bound to have pissed somebody off in the process. Like, I took out the bit where the kids asked the Hulk for his picture. I know a lot of people find that really funny, and it did make for a jarring edit, but overall, it was very insubstantial and it didn't affect the plot in any significant way. One of the bigger edits I actually did was I actually took out the moment where the Avengers talk about how time travel works. Now, you might think that that's kind of necessary in order to explain how that universe understands its time travel, but think about it for a minute. Do the rules that they actually set up and establish in that scene come into play anywhere else in the movie? Maybe when Nebula shoots her past self and doesn't die in the process, but overall, you don't find anybody coming back to that scene to reference to it. To me, it just felt like an excuse to crap on old beloved time travel movies. And really, if Looper has taught me anything, it's who really cares how time travel works?
You don't want to talk about time travel, because if we start talking about it, then we're going to be here all day talking about it, making diagrams with straws. It doesn't matter.
Probably the biggest thing I removed from this film was the Cap versus Cap fight. Now, yes, it was a great scene. It was fun to see them play on the I can do this all day cliche. And yeah, it was a nice, funny payoff to the America's ass bit.
As far as I'm concerned, that's America's ass.
But ask yourself something. Seriously, what's the point of this scene? What does it bring to the table? What does it establish narratively? What does it set up for later in the film? What does it pay off from previous in the film? Besides the America's ass joke again.
That is America's ass.
I had a hard time trying to figure out why this scene existed outside of wouldn't it be cool to see Captain America fight Captain America. So ultimately, in the name of keeping things concise, I had to let it go. I'm sorry, but these are the type of tough decisions that actual editors make. Remember, a big deal was made of Catherine Langford being cast in the movie in a mysterious role, and she's not in the final product. So it's not out of the ordinary for an entire section like that to just disappear in the edit. Then again, I could have easily cut Stan Lee's cameo, but I didn't, because I'm not a monster. In the end, I did manage to get Avengers Endgame down to 2 hours and 49 minutes, and that's with the end credits. For a first attempt, I don't think that's that bad. I initially wanted to hit 2:45, but I'll take it. And you know something? This was fun. It was a new and interesting way of looking at a movie that I already liked. It let me see why the filmmakers made certain decisions, why they kept certain scenes and certain shots as long or as short as they did. But of course, no movie is 100% perfect, which is why I felt I could go in and make my own edits to the film. Now, I would love to show you what I did, but I can't exactly go around sharing the Wulff cut of Avengers Endgame for obvious copyright reasons. I will try, however, to put a Google Doc link in the description to exactly what edits I made to share with you so that maybe you can give it a shot yourself. You can take Avengers Endgame and cut it up to follow my lead or your own way. Maybe one day I'll come back to this and actually try to edit the movie down to my initial 2 hour, 45-minute goal. And who knows, maybe I'll get really ambitious and try for something like 2 hours and 30 minutes. I mean, after all, if Topher Grace of all people can edit down the Star Wars prequel trilogy into one movie, then I think I can manage taking a 3-hour movie and making it a little bit shorter every so often. I mean, again, it won't be perfect. It will be pretty janky because I am working with a Blu-ray rip. Yes, a Blu-ray rip of the film. So how do you feel about some random asshole taking the biggest film of all time and re-editing it to fit his own personal taste? Do you think I'm the devil, or do you think Avengers Endgame could actually stand to lose a couple of minutes here and there. Let me know down below or anywhere on the internet. Of course, I will have Amazon links in the description to some Avengers stuff, including a Blu-ray copy of Avengers Endgame if you want to try this out for yourself, or if you want to just watch the movie the way God intended. I mean, I don't blame you, it's a lot easier. And of course, don't forget that we have new videos on this channel every single Tuesday and Wednesday, with Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern being Wulff Den Live. So subscribe to see all of that, like this video, and share with a friend who also thinks Avengers Endgame is just too damn long, because it is. Honestly, it kind of is. Thank you all for watching. I will see you next time. Wash your hands.